Welcome to our special celebration of the glorious past of Leeds United Football Club. We'll remember the club's greatest era, featuring the stars of the team built by Don Revie. But Leeds' success continues up to the present. We'll feature the stars of the 80s and 90s, as well as the youngsters of today who aim to take the club to fresh success. So sit back and enjoy this collector's item, the great names who've worn the Leeds shirt with distinction in the past 40 years. Jack Charlton was one of the most famous faces in football for more than 3 decades. He was born into a football dynasty in the northeast. His uncle Jackie Milburn was Newcastle United's star striker after the Second World War, and all his family were immersed in the game. His brother Bobby became one of England's greatest ever players. Jack perhaps was not best with the same talent, but he made up for it with his desire to succeed. An uncompromising centre-half and always a threat in the opposing penalty area. His determination helped him become an England regular. He won nearly every honour in the game as a player, including a World Cup winners' medal, and when he retired, he embarked on a hugely successful career in management at club and international level. If one player personifies the Revie years at Leeds, it's Billy Bremner. The firebrand Scotsman was his manager's voice on the field. Leeds fans identify with him as one of the club's all-time legends, and that's because he was simply one of their best ever players. He played his whole career in the centre of midfield, a minefield of flying boots and aggression. He was small in stature, but he possessed immense physical strength and unbreakable will. He was a leader of his team, totally unselfish, and often a target for hostility from opposition players and fans. His personality also made him the man most likely to be involved in confrontation with referees. But beneath all that, he was a gifted passer of the ball, tactically astute and superb going forward looking for goals. When he died young, Leeds and Scotland lost a man who was irreplaceable. Few players were more maligned in their careers than Norman Hunter, but this man was one of the most distinguished and talented centre-backs in British football in the 60s and 70s. He was heavily left-footed, but he was a fine passer of the ball out of defence, and he formed one of the most famous defensive pairings in England, along with international teammate Jack Charlton. He was a top-class reader of the game, and he offered great cover for all his defensive teammates. The club helped foster the legend around him that he was hard and uncompromising, and it was true that Hunter was ruthless in the tackle. But there was much more to Norman's game, and any striker who ever played against him recognised that he was an exceptional all-rounder, both in stopping the opposition and starting Leeds going forward after he'd won the ball. Paul Reaney broke into the Leeds United side at the same time as Norman Hunter. Their careers ran side by side in many ways, except that Reaney managed to stay at the top for even longer. Revie had wanted to freshen up Leeds in the early 60s. He was looking for young professionals with good habits and a hunger to reach the very top and stay there. Paul Reaney fitted the bill perfectly. He had pace, he knew his role as a defender, and he knew when to leave some of Leeds' more extravagant talents to create havoc. But Reaney was the sort of player every top team needs. Utterly dependable. He never looked for the limelight, but everyone in the game knew that he was always one of Don Revie's most prized assets. Peter Lorimer is revered as one of the finest individual talents to have ever played for Leeds United and Scotland. Like so many others in a unique period, Lorimer was moulded by the club from a talented, raw youth into an all-round player and a man with the temperament to deal with even the hottest atmosphere in the club and international arena. By trade he was a winger, but he was far too clever a player to be restricted in such a role. He could play anywhere on the right-hand side, often tucking into midfield. He created a club goal-scoring record in a 19-year career, and his ball striking was simply world-class. Every goalkeeper in the world feared the power of his shooting, the master of the spectacular. Like all great club sides, Leeds United players came in all shapes and sizes. Every man had strengths and weaknesses, but everyone at the club knew that only one player was the perfect athlete, and that was Paul Madeley. He was tall, powerful and quick, elegant in possession, and he possessed a magnificent football brain. In the modern game, a man with his range of gifts would be worth tens of millions. But he was another player taken on young by Leeds and immersed in the club's ways. As a result, he gave Leeds almost 20 years unbroken service. He played in every outfield position, such was his versatility, and he could be relied on to cover for any injury. He was supremely consistent, and he graced the England squad. If the national team had enjoyed more success in the 70s, there's little doubt Madeley would have become one of the world's biggest stars. One of the reasons for Leeds' supremacy in England in the late 60s and early 70s was the tactical sophistication of their football. In many ways, they were years ahead of their opposition, and the role of Terry Cooper seemed to exemplify that. Leeds played with an orthodox back four, and Cooper was the left fullback, well equipped for basic duties. But that was only half the story. Cooper revolutionised the position. He was one of the finest overlapping attacking fullbacks England ever produced. And not only was he good getting forward, with the ball at his feet, he had the trickery and inventiveness of any striker. A fine touch, a beautiful runner with the ball, and Leeds fans loved him, for he was one of the showmen in the team too. In a team of stars, John Giles still stood out. That's because he was a world-class midfielder. Unlike many of the home-produced youngsters in the Leeds squad, he was a man Leeds set out to capture in the transfer market because they knew the influence he would bring with him. Manchester United's decision to let him go would come to haunt them. He arrived as a talented winger, but Leeds polished him into the complete midfield player. He was simply the best passer of his generation, a dead ball expert and a magnificent tactician. But along with Billy Bremner, he formed a formidable midfield double act. He too could be hard and uncompromising, and he possessed an insatiable desire to drive Leeds towards success. His great career continued when he left Leeds in 1974 to rejuvenate West Bromwich Albion, and he helped take the Republic of Ireland onto the world stage for the first time. Any top team is only as good as its goalkeeper, and many top sides have had a problem replacing a man who's been a fixture in the position. But in David Harvey, Leeds had a ready-made replacement for Gary Sprake. Harvey possessed a superb temperament, unflappable and nerveless. He was blessed with natural gymnastic ability, and it was no surprise that when he finally broke into the Leeds side, he soon followed up by establishing himself as Scotland's #1. Success with Leeds coincided with Scotland's qualification for the 1974 World Cup, and suddenly Harvey became one of the top keepers in the world. It was no coincidence that some of Leeds' most flamboyant football came when he was the man in goal. Surely the air of confidence that emanated from him rubbed off on all the men in front of him. As Leeds built the foundations of their dominance in the 60s, their reputation went before them. Hard, uncompromising and rugged. The reality was different, and Eddie Gray was the proof. The history of Scottish football is full of wingers with flair and skill, crowd pleasers, and for many, Gray is the greatest left winger Scotland ever had. And he did it week in, week out for Leeds too. Although slight of build, he had determination and the courage to keep on taking on defenders in an era when ball players were not protected as they are today. Gray had a fantastic touch, a turn of pace, and the most priceless ability of all for a winger, the ability to provide service for his strikers. Leeds were a great all-round team, but Gray still stood out as an individual, and in continuing to work for the club since retirement, he has shown that Leeds was a lifelong love affair. Like all the great club sides, Leeds built their success on firm foundations with the defence. But by the mid-60s, it was time to find a cutting edge up front. The arrival of Mick Jones from Sheffield United in 1967 gave Leeds the presence they needed. He was an excellent leader of the line, an ever-willing target man who never shirked his responsibility as a team player. But he had other qualities too, sometimes overlooked. He had an excellent first touch in possession, and unlike many front men, had an inbuilt ability to link up play. He never sought the limelight for himself, but the big names around him knew just what an important part Mick Jones played as Leeds rose to dominance. When Alan Clark was signed from Leicester City in 1969, he was a big-name striker already. Some thought he might have trouble integrating into a close-knit team group, but as usual, Don Revie had done his homework. He knew Clark was quality, and he knew he'd fit the team well, because this was a player who wanted to succeed at the highest level. Clark was simply the coolest finisher of his time. He had a superb touch on the ball, and like all top strikers, there was a hint of selfishness in his play. He wanted to put the ball in the net, and he was expert at it. However big the game, Clark was the type of player who expected to score. For a period in the early 70s, he was recognised as England's best striker. And although he did have an individualist streak, his love for Leeds was real and lasted long after his playing days. One of the most remarkable features of Leeds' period of dominance was the tremendous consistency in team selection. Big names seldom missed games, and that meant disappointment for the fringe players trying to break through to the first team. But Trevor Cherry was the exception. He did become a first-teamer, and what helped him was his versatility. He could play at fullback, in midfield, and even at centre-back. After signing from Huddersfield, he learned as a youngster by watching some of the best around, the men in the Leeds first team. So when his chance came, he knew the standard expected of him. He took on the responsibility of keeping Leeds on top, and his all-round professionalism led to international selection. Leeds in the 60s had to scrap their way to the top. In the 70s, they had to stay there, and the demands of their own fans changed too. They now expected success with style. That's why they bought Tony Curry in 1976 from Sheffield United. A gifted footballer, a man with a delightful first touch, and an eye for a defence-splitting pass. And he could also score wonderful goals. Wherever he played, Curry was a crowd pleaser, and even though injuries disrupted his career, he did enough to be remembered as one of the best creative midfield players of his time in the English game. Many Leeds fans remember him with affection because he always tried to play the beautiful game. Being a Scotsman coming to Leeds from Aberdeen, to follow the legacy of men like Bremner, Gray and Lorimer was a formidable prospect. And when he first arrived at Elland Road in 1977, the size of the task might well have intimidated Arthur Graham. But he was determined to prove to the crowd that he too had ability, and that he too wanted to be a success. He built a fine career for himself, which led to international honours. For men like Graham coming to Leeds at that period, the objective was a tough one, to try to keep the club on top. But this was one player who gave his all, and playing for Leeds for 6 years as he did was an achievement in itself. The career of John Lukic seems to sum up Leeds in the 80s and 90s. His first few years at the club were not easy. Leeds were looking to rebuild. But when he returned in 1990, it heralded a remarkable transformation in the club's fortunes. Lukic became a better keeper for his time at Arsenal, but Leeds were the ones to profit. He inspired confidence throughout his defence as Leeds surged to the title. He was exceptionally brave and blessed with great powers of concentration. Few top keepers of the period had more ups and downs in their careers than this man, but he showed exceptional strength of character to bounce back repeatedly. A drawer full of medals tells its own story. Lukic can look back with pride on a long and successful career. For Leeds fans, Billy Bremner is an all-time hero, but David Batty isn't far behind. And if you told Batty himself that, it would mean more to him than all the medals and England caps. The reason is that Batty is a local boy, and he grew up idolising Bremner and Johnny Giles in the Leeds midfield, dreaming of following in their illustrious footsteps on the Elland Road turf. When his chance came, Batty took it. An exceptional defensive midfield player, he knew his limitations, but always played to his strengths for the good of the team. He was a gem unearthed by Howard Wilkinson, an unfussy pro who largely shunned the celebrity limelight. But how Leeds missed him when he moved on to Blackburn. Success followed him there though, truly a player's player, and one of Leeds' players of the 90s. Young talents like Gary Speed were thin on the ground for Leeds in the late 80s, but from the moment they first spotted him in Wales, Leeds knew they had found something special. He possessed a multitude of gifts: pace, a fine left foot, an eye for goal, and exceptional aerial ability for a midfield player. He burst onto the scene young, helping Leeds back to the top while still hardly out of his teens. And unlike so many talented youngsters, he didn't fade away. He went on to become a fixture in the Welsh national side, and after a spell at Everton, he'd enjoy repeated success with Newcastle. Surely many Leeds fans wish he had never left Elland Road. Gordon Strachan was a top player before he ever arrived at Elland Road. He'd been a key man in one of Scottish football's greatest ever stories of success as Aberdeen conquered Europe. He went on to Manchester United and arguably became their best player for a time. So it was a masterstroke by Howard Wilkinson to bring Strachan to Leeds. Still, few can have guessed just how big a role Strachan would play for the club. His professionalism and attitude became the benchmark for all Leeds players. He'd been a winner throughout his career, and he came to Leeds to win things too. He did not disappoint. A masterful right-sided player, and during his time with Leeds, surely the best man in his position in the country. He played for 13 clubs in all, but Lee Chapman's career highlights nearly all came playing for Leeds. An intelligent man with wide-ranging interests outside the game, he'd be the first to agree he wasn't the most gifted striker in England, but he knew the job asked of him, and he set about doing it to the absolute best of his ability. He was a classic target man, good in the air, expert at holding the ball up and bringing teammates into play. And in the opposition penalty area, he was a handful for the best defenders. Lee Chapman's career had many setbacks, but what a contribution he made to Leeds' story of success. No one can underestimate the strength of rivalry between arguably Yorkshire's two biggest clubs, Sheffield Wednesday and Leeds, have always rather enjoyed it when the other was struggling. And few high-profile players have moved between them, but Mel Sterland was the exception. He enjoyed great early success as a muscular, rampaging fullback for the Owls until his career was sidetracked by injury. It took great character for Sterland to come back. After a season with Rangers, it was the move to Leeds which rejuvenated him. He enjoyed a late flourish at Elland Road, displaying the powerful defending which first brought him to prominence. And he can look back with pride, having served both Yorkshire's biggest clubs with distinction. For many, it's a mystery why Chris Fairclough didn't manage to achieve even more in the game. He was a fine and rare talent, a strong, disciplined defender with the ability and pace to be the launch pad for attack once possession had been won. But Leeds fans can probably say they saw the best of him. Early on, the comparison with Des Walker at Nottingham Forest seemed obvious. Perhaps he couldn't quite boast Walker's lightning acceleration, but Fairclough's game lost little in comparison to the man who was then England's top defender. In another period, Fairclough may well have gone on to make his mark at international level, but all who saw him play will remember an excellent and underrated defender. As a ball striker, this man had few equals. Gary McAllister's only problem in life was deciding which kind of ball he'd earn a living by striking, a football or a golf ball. As one of the best juniors in Scotland, he had the choice of career. But football won out, and for Motherwell, McAllister was soon off to England and a glittering career which started at Leicester City. All the top clubs were interested in him, but Leeds won the race to sign him in 1990. He was a purist's delight, arguably the best passer of a ball seen at Elland Road since Johnny Giles, and a scorer of goals from set pieces and open play. He became a fixture in the Scotland squad, and he's been an exemplary professional for more than a decade, as Coventry would later discover.
And it's 2-1. 2 for McAllister, 2 for Leeds.
Would you believe it? Leeds United have snatched victory in stoppage time.
When Chris White signed for Leeds in 1990, there was surprise. This was a man who'd spent much of his early career trying to establish himself as an automatic choice at Arsenal. But Leeds knew what they were getting, a man who knew his job through and through. He only needed the chance to play regular football in the top division, and Leeds benefited by getting the best 4 years of White's career. An unfussy defender, he knew his position inside out, and he took pride in subduing opposition strikers. He was a man a manager could rely on, and a man to build a defence around. David Weatherall had a career to be proud of at Leeds. He was part of the success story of the 90s from the championship year onward. The fans may have looked elsewhere for heroes, but Weatherall was just as important. A reliable defender who learned the game inside out and made the absolute best of his own ability. He was born with intelligence. He used it to earn a university degree, and he applied that intelligence to his development as a footballer. He'd agree that if you broke his game down, he wasn't exceptional in any aspect, but he had few weaknesses, and anyone who played as he did in the top division for almost a decade can look back with pride on a job well done. All the Wallace brothers were born with ability, but Rod may be remembered as the one who made the most of it. Ray and Danny Wallace had good careers, but Rod kept himself at the top far longer. And Leeds fans reckon they saw the best of him between 1991 and 98. Howard Wilkinson knew he could bring out something extra in him when he signed. And even after Wilco moved on, Rod continued to provide a cutting edge. Like his brothers, he had more than a fair share of injury to overcome, but it was remarkable that he seemed to maintain his pace for so long. He was just the sort of striker that defenders hate playing against. Quick, unpredictable, and likely to turn a game on its head with a moment of inspiration. Leeds under Howard Wilkinson produced some shrewd moves in the transfer market, but they seldom gambled as they did with Eric Cantona. The mercurial Frenchman seemed on the slide to obscurity in his native land and was reduced to trying to fix up trials for himself in England in 1991. When Wilkinson heard of this, he didn't hesitate. Leeds signed Cantona and added a new dimension to their game. From the start, he was a success, a unique talent, far removed from the stereotype of the professional footballer. The love affair would not last long. Soon Manchester United's attention would flatter Cantona's ego. But Leeds is where the story of resurrection began. They say one club men are a dying breed in top-class football. Gary Kelly proves the opposite. He's been a first-team player at Leeds for more than a decade. He burst onto the scene as a pacey teenager who was playing for the Republic of Ireland in the World Cup finals just a couple of years after making his debut. The only factor to threaten his superb level of consistency was injury. His speed was dulled a little over the years, but every time he sustained a serious setback, he redoubled his determination to come back. As a result, he'll be remembered as one of Leeds' best ever fullbacks, and he played a full part in Ireland's successes too. Tony Dorigo was one of the best left-backs in English football in the 90s, and England's gain was most certainly Australia's loss. The decision to opt to play for England rather than his native Australia certainly helped Dorigo establish himself in his adopted home. It meant he didn't have to worry about the so-called foreigner rules, which made team selection tricky for big clubs in European competition for a while. But Dorigo didn't need the extra helping hand. He was a classy left-back with good pace and creative going forward. He served Leeds well and probably helped create a new generation of fans for Leeds down under, despite that decision to play for England. Leeds caused some surprise in the English game when they went looking to recruit more firepower in 1994. But the game was changing fast at that stage, and Leeds were adapting. Tony Yeboah was the man they came up with. He was largely unknown to English audiences, but his talents were clear. Soon he'd established himself as a successful member of the so-called Foreign Legion pouring into the country, attracted by the high wages and the game's increased commercial profile. Yeboah's game was built on power and pace, and when fully fit, that made him a formidable opponent. It was no surprise that after leaving Leeds, he returned to Germany to become an equally big star in the Bundesliga. Sheffield Wednesday's loss was most certainly Leeds' gain when Carlton Palmer moved to Elland Road in 1994. At that time, Palmer was one of the top midfield players in England. He knew his style of play wasn't universally liked, but he also knew the job expected of him by management, and he took great pride in doing it effectively. He also realised he'd never win many awards for technical quality, but his attributes earned him respect within the game. A tireless worker with endless stamina, and every match he played in mattered to Carlton Palmer. His commitment was total, and when other talented players were finding the going toughest, it was to Palmer they looked for inspiration. Going back to the era of Albert Johannesson, Leeds have had strong links with South Africa, but the friendship was cemented by the enormous contribution of Lucas Radebe to Leeds. He admits himself he found the pace and intensity of the English game daunting at first, but with his physique and desire to make the grade, he overcame all doubt to establish himself as one of the club's best defenders. Radebe has been a leader on the field and one of the club's best ambassadors off it. He's also managed to juggle the demands of his club employers with the strain of travelling and the tremendous expectation as South Africa made their way onto the world stage for the first time. When your own uncle is already a top-class player in England, there's every encouragement to try your luck too. But Ian Hart didn't just follow Gary Kelly across the water, he trailed him all the way to Leeds. No one did him any favours when he got there, of course. He built a career for himself as the club's first choice left-back with his uncle on the right flank. It was a unique pairing, and while Ian didn't possess Gary's pace, he demonstrated immense determination to establish himself as one of the best left-backs in the English game. And after David Beckham, he's probably become the most deadly free kick taker in the Premiership. Hart's been written off more than once, both at club and international level. But so far, he's shown the resolution to come back every time.
And Hart with the shot. Oh, that's a magnificent shot.
News of a prodigious young talent reached England from Australia even before young Harry Kewell had shown up at Elland Road to join Leeds' youth setup. Within a few weeks, Leeds knew that Kewell had the ability to go right to the very top. He had pace and the ability to beat defenders on the run. And he possessed exceptional ability as a goal scorer. When he first burst into the first team, he looked set to become one of the biggest stars in English football. And even now, he's young enough and talented enough for that to happen. Injuries and loss of form have made it tougher for Kewell in recent seasons, but Leeds hope that through this testing period, Kewell will emerge a stronger player mentally. And if he does, the best is still to come.
Run in, and Kewell can make it 5, he does. It's Harry Kewell.
Nigel Martyn's journey to the top level of the game will encourage any youngster who despaired of getting a chance to show his ability. Martyn was playing part-time in his native Cornwall until his 20s. any hope of a shot at the big time seemed remote indeed. But then a scout tipped off Bristol Rovers. Crystal Palace were looking for a new keeper, and within 2 years, Martin was starring, as Palace enjoyed a famous FA Cup run. Then it was only a matter of time before a move to one of the top clubs. And Martin improved still further once he got to Leeds, seeing off all competition to make the goalkeeping spot his own until the arrival of young Paul Robinson. But even now, it would be foolish to think that Martin's best years are behind him. Lee Bowyer was tipped to become a major star long before he joined Leeds. He emerged at Charlton Athletic, soon earning recognition with England's underage teams. When Charlton decided he could go in 1996, Leeds wasted no time, believing in his ability, while others worried that his temperament and off-field behaviour might hold him back. There's no doubt that at Leeds he developed as a player as they hoped, capable of competing with the very best in the Champions League. But even he must agree, his off-field behaviour has caused him continued problems. He says he wants to show that he's learned from his mistakes, and if he has, Leeds will be reluctant to let him go.
That's a splendid strike by Lee Bowyer.
Leeds' then management duo of David O'Leary and George Graham spent considerable time in Portugal in 1996 and 7. They weren't on holiday, they were making sure they'd be first in the queue for the services of Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank. The Dutch striker's sudden emergence with Boavista was only the start. Once he arrived in England, his career really took off. Blessed with enormous physical strength and pace, his power shooting put him in a class apart. One of the few strikers in top-class football who can really be relied on to average in and around a goal every 2 games when fit. His form at Leeds for 2 devastating seasons made him one of the hottest commodities in the European game. And sadly for Leeds, he'd proved just as dangerous when he returned to play for Chelsea. But for his off-the-field problems, Jonathan Woodgate could already be established as England's top young centre-back. Even though his career suffered a serious setback through involvement in a high-profile court case, Woodgate still possesses the ability to go right to the very top. A tall and graceful defender, he's learned the basics of his position well. But it's his ability to use the ball and move forward into midfield which are exceptional, a player with a talent given to very few. Now he has to prove that he wants to make the most of it. If he does, there's little doubt that Leeds will have a major asset for years to come, and he could yet make up the ground he's lost in gaining international recognition too. Alan Smith is yet another product of Leeds' superb academy. But while the club have scoured the globe for some of their young talent, they didn't have to look far for Smith. He is Leeds through and through. He has a beautiful touch in possession, he's a cool finisher, and possesses genuine hunger to become a top player. But he knows he has more to learn. There's a thin line between aggression and foul play, and too often Smith has strayed over that line. If he can learn to keep his aggression within limits, there is no limit to what he can achieve. From a generation of fine youngsters, Alan Smith could prove the best of the lot. With so many good midfield players on their books, it was a surprise when Leeds went to Norway to sign a 21-year-old in 1999. But they knew that if they didn't get Eric Bakker, one of England's other top clubs would soon grab his signature. He was considered one for the future, but from the moment he arrived at Leeds, Bakker's improvement was startling. He had outstanding pace and he slotted straight into the Leeds four-man midfield, providing extra energy and drive. A classic box-to-box midfield player, but Bakker can become even better. He can establish himself as one of the first names on the Leeds team sheet and could become a regular in the Norwegian side for years to come. Fans of English football who watched Danny Mills developing at Norwich and Charlton were just beginning to doubt whether any of the top sides would ever try to sign this fullback. For both his previous clubs he'd been outstanding, but it took Leeds to bring the talent to wider recognition. Perhaps other clubs were put off by the aggression in his game, and Mills knows that a lack of discipline has cost him dear at times. But he wants to be a winner, and he's full of self-belief. Add those qualities to his speed, his tackling ability, and his appetite for rampaging forward, and you have one of the best fullbacks in the country. And England honours inevitably followed as Mills represented his country in the 2002 World Cup. The West Ham Academy has produced some of the best English footballers of the past 50 years. And when Rio Ferdinand burst onto the scene as a teenager, it was clear he had the ability and temperament to be right at home in the first team. Ferdinand's rise has been spectacular. Leeds broke the transfer record to sign him, and at Elland Road he got better and better under David O'Leary. For all his natural gifts, his main attribute is the desire to be the very best. A fine World Cup for England took his career to a new level, and even though Manchester United had been thwarted in previous transfer bids, there was no way they would miss out again. Money was no object. Leeds were not in a position to refuse, and so Ferdinand became the subject of the biggest transfer in British history. Many players have come to Leeds from foreign shores and struggled to prove that they were good enough to make it in one of the most competitive leagues in the world. But Mark Viduka faced an added burden. He had to show that he could move from Scotland to England. The Australian had been a roaring success at Celtic and he loved playing for them. But he knew there'd always be critics who would say he could only do it in an inferior league. So Viduka decided to meet them head on by signing for Leeds. And when he's fit and on form, there's no argument. He has a superb touch for a big man and an inbuilt sense of where the goal is. On his day, the Australian international can be the equal of any striker in the English Premier League. How fitting that we leave you with the scenes of perhaps Leeds' best ever team celebrating with one of their many trophies. It was a great era for the club. But Leeds fans have had more to celebrate since then, and now the aim is to go on to further success. With that sort of tradition to draw on, who would bet against it? Goodbye for now.